Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit study, the pale blue glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the keyboard, refreshing the location tracking app he had installed on Emily's phone a month ago, an app she didn't know existed. The green dot blinked steadily on the map, showing her exact location, 12 miles away, parked outside a high-end restaurant on the other side of town. She had said she was at her mother's place for the weekend. She's been feeling lonely, Emily had claimed with that warm smile Daniel had fallen in love with 15 years ago. But something had changed in the past year. The long silences when she thought he wasn't looking, the mysterious calls she dismissed as work stuff, and her sudden disinterest in the little rituals that once defined their marriage. All of it gnawed at him. A quiet beep from his phone broke his trance. The green dot hadn't moved. Still there, still at Le Jardin, the romantic French restaurant she'd always mentioned wanting to visit. His stomach churned. He clicked through to his hidden camera feed, the one he'd set up in their garage 2 weeks earlier. Sure enough, her car was gone. Daniel clenched his fists. This wasn't a misunderstanding or some silly mix-up. His suspicions had grown too loud to ignore. He couldn't afford to be wrong, not this time. The memory of Emily slipping out of their house that morning replayed in his mind like a broken record. She had kissed him on the cheek, her floral perfume lingering long after the door shut behind her. "I'll call you later," she had said, her voice unnervingly casual. He wanted to believe her, but there had been something too rehearsed in her tone, like an actor repeating a line she no longer believed in. It was almost 8 p.m. now, and the restaurant's website confirmed they were fully booked. He decided he couldn't wait anymore. Grabbing his coat and keys, Daniel left the house, his heart pounding as if it wanted to escape his chest. The restaurant's parking lot came into view, bustling with luxury cars and couples hand in hand. Then, there it was, Emily's silver sedan, parked neatly in the corner. Daniel pulled into a spot several rows away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He sat for a moment, forcing himself to breathe. Then he got out, the cool night air prickling his skin. The entrance doors glowed invitingly, revealing glimpses of candlelit tables and laughing patrons. Daniel hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The host looked up and smiled. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," Daniel said. His voice was calm, steady. "But I'm looking for someone." His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her, Emily, her laughter floating above the gentle hum of conversation, seated across from a man who wasn't him. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribcage as he stood just inside the restaurant's doorway. The hostess, still waiting for a response, cocked her head slightly, her polite smile unwavering. "Would you like me to help you find your party?" "No," Daniel replied, his voice quieter this time, measured. "I'll take it from here." He stepped aside, allowing a couple to walk past him into the dining room and position himself near the edge of the bar. From this vantage point, he could see the entire space. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware, lending the room an air of elegance. Amid the murmur of conversation and the gentle clinking of wine glasses, Daniel spotted her, Emily. She was seated at a small table near the center of the room, the candlelight dancing off the blonde waves of her hair. She leaned forward slightly, her chin resting in her hand, a radiant smile gracing her face as she gazed at the man sitting across from her. The name rang bitterly in Daniel's mind. He knew of him, a co-worker from her office that Emily had casually mentioned once or twice, though never with any real detail. Now, seeing the two of them together, the pieces clicked into place. The way she laughed, the way she reached across the table to touch Mark's hand, it wasn't the behavior of two colleagues discussing work. It was intimate. Too intimate. Daniel ducked behind a large potted fern near the bar, positioning himself just out of their line of sight. He felt a dull ache in his chest, but anger was beginning to override the pain. He forced himself to observe, to take everything in. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. Mark leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of casual arrogance that set Daniel's teeth on edge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cocky grin that seemed permanently etched onto his face. As Emily laughed at something he said, Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Daniel's stomach churned as he watched Emily's eyes widen in delight. Mark opened the box to reveal a delicate bracelet, the diamonds catching the light in a mesmerizing display. Emily clasped her hands together, clearly enchanted, before allowing Mark to fasten the bracelet onto her wrist. Daniel felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. That bracelet, was it a replacement for the one he had given her last Christmas? The thought stung, but it also strengthened his resolve. He reached into his pocket and discreetly pulled out his phone. Pretending to scroll through messages, he raised the phone slightly and snapped a photo of the scene. For several minutes, he remained rooted to the spot, his emotions swinging wildly between disbelief and cold fury. Emily glanced at Mark with an expression Daniel recognized all too well, a look of adoration she hadn't given him in years. It was as if she had shed the weight of their shared life, her laughter now carefree, untethered. What struck him most, though, was the ease of their interaction. Emily and Mark didn't look like two people sneaking around. They looked comfortable, as though this wasn't their first romantic dinner together. How many nights had she lied to him? How many weekends had she claimed to visit her mother when she was here, in this very spot, with him? Daniel's fingers itched to march over to their table, to demand answers, to unleash the storm that had been building inside him, but not yet. He wasn't ready. He needed more proof, more control. A confrontation now would be too raw, too emotional, and he refused to let them see him as anything less than composed. Instead, he ordered a drink from the bar and settled into a stool, close enough to keep watching but far enough to remain unnoticed. As he sipped his whiskey, the bitter liquid burning his throat, he let his mind race through every scenario. He wouldn't just catch them, he would expose them. Publicly, decisively, and with no chance of escape. For now, he waited, a quiet observer in a room filled with laughter, his rage bubbling just beneath the surface. The restaurant hummed with life, yet for Daniel, the world had narrowed to the scene unfolding at Emily and Mark's table. He could hear nothing but the thundering beat of his own pulse as he clenched his glass, the condensation pooling onto his fingertips. He sat at the bar, half turned toward the dining room, feigning interest in the muted TV above the bartender's station. In reality, his eyes never left his wife. Emily leaned closer to Mark now, her elbow resting on the table as she traced the rim of her wine glass with a perfectly manicured finger. Mark was talking, his gestures animated, and she nodded along, her smile radiant and utterly unrecognizable to Daniel. When had she started smiling like that? That light, carefree expression belonged to someone he no longer knew. A sharp, cold pang gripped his chest. Was it humiliation? Betrayal? No, it was rage, searing and relentless. Yet he forced himself to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to let his emotions run wild, not yet. Not here. Daniel tapped the side of his phone, the device still open to the tracking app. Evidence, he reminded himself, his jaw tightening. That was the key. He needed more proof before he acted. One photo wouldn't be enough to paint the picture of betrayal as vividly as it needed to be. He swiped his camera app open again, capturing a short video of Emily's hand resting on Mark's. The glint of the new bracelet catching the light. The gesture was tender and intimate, undeniably damning. He turned his attention to the surrounding diners, observing how they paid little attention to the pair. They had no idea the spectacle of deceit playing out in their midst. Daniel's lip curled into a faint smirk. That would change soon enough. These unsuspecting patrons would witness what he had planned, and Emily's pristine facade would crumble in front of them all. She had underestimated him. Both of that would be their undoing. As he sat there, his mind churned through the details of what was about to happen. He envisioned the confrontation, carefully constructing every word he would say. There would be no yelling, no emotional outbursts. That wasn't his style. He would remain calm, methodical, and devastatingly precise. This wasn't just about catching Emily in her lie. It was about reclaiming control, his dignity, and ensuring that they both felt the weight of their betrayal. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah, his sister, who had been his confidant in this ordeal. Sarah, anything? Daniel, yes, she's here with him. I'm about to confront them. Sarah, stay calm. Don't let them rattle you. Daniel, I've got this. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and glanced at the bartender, signaling for another drink. As he waited, he kept a measured eye on the table. Emily's laugh rang out again, and this time it was too much. He felt his fingers twitch, his body almost rising instinctively. But no, he couldn't storm over just yet. Timing was everything. He needed to make sure the moment was unforgettable. When his drink arrived, Daniel's thoughts turned to the final piece of his plan, the presentation. He had evidence on his phone, screenshots of messages, photos from the private investigator he had hired, and now the footage he had just captured. But he wanted to make an impact that would leave no room for denial, no space for excuses. He pulled out a small USB drive from his pocket. On it were all the files, neatly organized and timestamped. He had stopped by an electronics store earlier that week to buy a portable projector, just in case he needed a way to display the evidence in full view. His car was parked nearby, and he could retrieve it in minutes. Daniel took a long, steadying breath and looked down at his watch. He had been there for nearly an hour. He didn't want to wait much longer. The anticipation was eating away at him, but he also needed to strike at the perfect moment. And then it happened. Mark leaned across the table, his voice low, his hand brushing Emily's cheek as he whispered something in her ear. Emily laughed softly and nodded. Mark stood, tossing his napkin onto the table, and extended his hand to her. She hesitated for just a second before taking it, rising gracefully from her seat. They were leaving. Daniel's mind raced as he pushed back from the bar, abandoning his half-finished drink. He followed at a safe distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. Emily and Mark made their way toward the exit, their hands brushing but not fully clasping, still cautious, still pretending to maintain the illusion that they were just coworkers. As they passed by the hostess stand, Daniel saw his opportunity. He quickened his pace, his footsteps light but deliberate. "Emily!" he called, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. She froze mid-step, her hand still hovering near Mark's. Slowly, she turned, her eyes widening in shock as they locked onto his. Mark, standing a foot away, shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor faltering under Daniel's piercing gaze. "Daniel?" Emily's voice was faint, trembling. Daniel took another step forward, his expression calm but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "Don't let me interrupt," he said, his voice steady. "You seem to be having such a lovely evening." The restaurant fell silent, every pair of eyes now fixed on the three of them. Emily's face turned a deep shade of crimson, and Mark took an instinctive step back. The moment had arrived, and Daniel was ready to strike. The weight of the restaurant's silence settled over the trio like a heavy fog. Every clink of silverware ceased, every whisper evaporated. Daniel stood tall, his calm demeanor belying the storm raging inside him. He felt every set of eyes on him, their curiosity sharpening the edge of his resolve. Emily, frozen in place, seemed to shrink under the intensity of his gaze. "Boy, am I, Daniel?" She stammered, her voice barely audible. Her lips moved, but no coherent words followed. She cast a desperate glance at Mark, whose confident smirk had dissolved into visible discomfort. "Don't stop on my account," Daniel said, his voice calm but laced with icy sarcasm. "Please, continue. I'd love to hear what you two were discussing." His eyes darted to Mark, who instinctively looked away, his shoulders stiffening. "Look, man," Mark began, his voice dripping with forced bravado. "I think you might be misunderstanding?" Daniel's voice rose, but not in volume, just enough to slice through Mark's feeble protest. He pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. "I suppose I misunderstood this, then." He tapped the screen, and a series of photos appeared. Emily and Mark, smiling and close, from dates at other places. He swiped through them, slowly, methodically, ensuring everyone watching could catch a glimpse. The diners murmured, some leaning forward in their chairs, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. The hostess shifted uneasily behind her stand, torn between intervening and letting the drama unfold. "Daniel, please, let's talk about this," Emily whispered, stepping closer to him, her voice trembling. Her hand reached out as if to touch his arm, but he pulled back. The movement deliberate and cold. "Talk? Oh, now you want to talk?" Daniel's calm demeanor cracked just slightly, a sharp edge slipping into his voice. "You had plenty of opportunities to talk, Emily. At home, with me, but instead, here you are, with him." His eyes flicked to Mark, who shifted on his feet, visibly uneasy. "Look, dude, we don't need to do this here," Mark muttered, his voice low. "This is between you and her." "Oh, don't worry, Mark," Daniel snapped, his tone as sharp as a blade. "You're very much a part of this. In fact, why don't you stay? I want you to hear this too." Mark looked as though he wanted to disappear into the floor, but he stayed rooted in place. Emily's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup doing little to mask the guilt etched into her features. Daniel reached into his pocket again, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, the tension in the room thickening with every movement. "You see, Emily, I've been busy these past few weeks," he said, his voice steady. "While you've been entertaining yourself, I've been preparing. This," he held up the papers, "a copy of the divorce petition, already signed and filed." The gasp from Emily was audible, sharp and immediate. "Divorce?" she choked, her voice cracking. "Daniel, no. Please, let's talk about this. This isn't what you think. It's not serious. It's not serious?" Daniel cut her off, his tone dripping with incredulity. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, pretending you were at your mother's house while you were here with him, and you want me to believe it's not serious?" Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked to Mark, who raised his hand slightly, palms outward, as if to absolve himself from the situation. "Isn't just between you and me anymore, Emily," Daniel continued, his voice rising slightly, enough to ensure the audience could hear every word. "You made this public the moment you decided to betray me. So here we are." The diners exchanged hushed whispers, some pulling out their phones to document the scene. Emily's humiliation deepened as she noticed a man at a nearby table holding up his phone, recording discreetly. She turned her head away, her face flushed with shame. "Daniel," let's try it again, her voice pleading. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Daniel's laughter was hollow, devoid of warmth. "You didn't want to hurt me, but you didn't hesitate to make a mockery of our marriage, of me. You didn't think twice about sneaking out, lying to my face, and humiliating me." "Hey, that's enough," Mark interjected, stepping forward. "I don't know what kind of husband you've been, but maybe if you paid more attention to your wife." Before he could finish, Daniel turned on him, his voice icy and measured. "Don't you dare lecture me. You don't know a damn thing about me, Mark. But I know plenty about you, about your failed business ventures, about the loans you've been defaulting on. And now, you've attached yourself to my wife, hoping she'll be your next financial lifeline." He took a step closer to Mark, his presence commanding. "So don't play the moral high ground with me." Mark shrank back, his bravado evaporating. Emily's eyes darted between the two men, her expression a mixture of panic and despair. "This ends now," Daniel said, turning back to Emily. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. The papers are filed, and you'll be hearing from them soon. As for you," he added, glancing at Mark, "I suggest you find another meal ticket. This one's about to dry up." With that, Daniel turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Emily and Mark standing in stunned silence as the restaurant buzzed with whispers. As the cool night air hit his face, Daniel felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't just the end of his marriage. It was the beginning of his freedom. The restaurant's doors closed behind Daniel with a soft thud, muffling the whispers and murmurs of the stunned patrons inside. The cool night air wrapped around him, sharp and bracing, as if to cleanse him of the emotional storm he'd just weathered. His steps slowed as he reached his car, the quiet of the evening contrasting starkly with the chaos he'd left behind. For the first time in weeks, he felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness, a sense of resolution. Sliding into the driver's seat, Daniel sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He stared out at the restaurant's glowing facade, half expecting Emily to rush out after him to beg for another chance. But the doorway remained empty, and the thought of her doing so didn't ignite the hope it might have weeks ago. Tonight had been the culmination of all his suspicions, his heartbreak, and his anger. And while the confrontation had been cathartic, he realized it was only the beginning of the next chapter. He started the car and drove home, his mind surprisingly clear. There was no internal debate, no second-guessing his decision. Emily's betrayal had carved a wound deep enough to sever any lingering threads of attachment. As he pulled into the driveway of their house, a house they had built together, filled with memories of their life, Daniel felt the finality of his actions settle into his bones. He wasn't returning to the home they'd shared as a couple. He was returning to the place where he would begin again. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. The absence of Emily's presence was palpable, but rather than feeling painful, it felt like space, room to breathe, to reclaim what had been his before their relationship. He walked through the familiar halls, taking in the framed photos on the walls, the small tokens of their shared life that now felt like relics of another time. He paused in the living room, where a single photo stood on the mantel. It was a picture of the two of them on their anniversary years ago, smiling broadly at the camera, arms wrapped around each other. For a moment, he felt the faint tug of nostalgia, a flicker of the love they had once shared. But as he picked up the frame and studied it, he felt something deeper: resolve. This chapter of his life was over, and it was time to move on. Daniel placed the photo face down and grabbed a box from the garage. Methodically, he began gathering items that reminded him of Emily: photos, trinkets, anything tied to her betrayal. It wasn't out of anger or bitterness, but rather a deliberate step toward reclaiming his space. By the time he was done, the box was full, and the living room felt oddly unfamiliar, without the remnants of their life together. Yet, there was a certain freedom in the unfamiliarity. It was his space now, and it would reflect his new reality. The next morning, Daniel woke early. For the first time in weeks, he felt rested, unburdened by the weight of suspicion and doubt. He brewed a cup of coffee and sat on the patio, letting the crisp morning air fill his lungs. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and blues, a reminder that life continued. No matter how tumultuous the previous day had been, Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring. "Well," she asked without preamble. "It's done," Daniel said simply. There was a pause before Sarah replied. "How do you feel?" "Lighter," he admitted. "It was hard, but I think it was necessary. I don't know what the future looks like yet, but I know I'm ready to face it." Sarah's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Dan. You deserve better than what she gave you, and now you get to find that." They talked for a while longer, Sarah's unwavering support bolstering his determination. By the time the call ended, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Over the next few days, Daniel took small but significant steps toward rebuilding. He called the lawyer to finalize the divorce proceedings, met with a real estate agent to discuss selling the house, and he even began packing up his belongings. The house, once a symbol of their life together, now felt like a weight he needed to shed. He wanted a fresh start, unencumbered by memories of what had been. One evening, as he sifted through boxes in the garage, he found an old journal he hadn't written in for years. Flipping through its pages, he was reminded of the dreams and goals he had before his life became entangled with Emily's. Travel, learning a new language, picking up the guitar again. It was as though the man he used to be was calling out to him, urging him to rediscover himself. Daniel closed the journal, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was excited, not just for what lay ahead, but for the person he would become. Life after betrayal wasn't the end. For Daniel, it was a new beginning.